G'day Nature Knows and welcome to another episode. Today we're going to be exploring this bit of forest and I'd like to show you some of the tips and tricks I've learnt over the years on how to find beautiful gliders and possums and things, so when you're out spotlighting around at night you increase your chances of finding them for yourself. Now, the best thing we should probably discuss is the habitat. Generally speaking, elevated forests with large mature trees in it are really quite vital for the possums and gliders and things like that, because obviously throughout the day they go and roost right up in the canopy in those dead branches and cavities within the tree. So if you're in a bit of new forestry without those mature trees, you're not going to have that structure for them to live throughout the day, and then you've got to have ample food and understory in that forest as well to support their diet. But I want to run through some of the key things to look out for. Now, for those of you that have followed us for a while, you'll have heard me discuss in previous episodes to keep an eye out for trees just like this. This tree is covered in nodules and scars, and it's weeping sap which has come down and grown black sooty mould on the bark here. There's lots of other evidence that I can see on this tree of all this torn up chafed bark, and that is literally from gliders of an evening, you know, really gripping into this tree and moving around and constantly scratching, and as you can see the bark falls and settles to the ground here. So we have that, the nodules. I can see further up this tree that there's lots of stripped bark hanging out off the tree, which is a primary indicator of, you know, where they position themselves at night. And there's multiple wounds leaking sap, which is what they feed on. It's a nice little sugary reward. So of a day when you're out walking, keep an eye out for beautiful big trees like this in mature forest, and come back of an evening. I highly recommend using an infrared light torch, because they don't detect that and it won't give away your presence, whereas a lot of, particularly the small gliders, are very sensitive to white light. So as you approach a tree like this, if you're using white light, you're likely to frighten them. They're likely to take off up the tree and you'll never see them. So where possible, use a infrared light and you definitely increase your chances of finding some beautiful gliders of an evening. Let's go explore some more forest and see what else we can find.
You may have noticed during filming that I was fidgeting around a bit. It was for these ants, but it did give me the time to then realise that all these beautiful honey eaters were taking advantage of the sap too. Just more subtle little cues and indicators giving away a good tree.
Alright Nature Nutters, we've been scanning through the forest and I found another classic tree. Now this doesn't have the wounds and scar tissue that I was talking about with the weeping sap, but what it does have is a stack of really good nesting hollows up top. So this would be a really ideal tree to come and stand with your torch right up close beside your eye and flick around some light up in that canopy, and if you see any nice little glowing dots staring back at you, that's likely to be some beautiful little mammal. Alright, so I have really high hopes for this bit of forest tonight because I'm seeing loads of beautiful big mature trees with lots of nesting potential up in the canopy. It's a beautiful open bit of forest, really easy to get some eye shine as you walk through it. But Mariella's going to pan round and show you all these beautiful mature trees around here. There's just so much possibility here. Notice this is a really good example as well. Lots of nodules up it. I don't see any leaking sap right now. This is a tree that they've fed on in the past, so it's got good nesting opportunities, so another good one to keep an eye out for tonight. Hey, so it's going to be really hard for you guys to see in the wide angle lens, but as I look up this tree, I can see certain bits of the bark that have a different tone colour, and that's where the animals have been frequently travelling up and down certain bits of the branches. So because of that, you could easily suggest that the possums and things have been in this tree at night. Right, a bit hard to tell in this lens, but Lots of traffic up this tree. Just up near the fork there's loads of torn up bark and weeping wounds. So another really good mature tree to check out tonight. Alright, Nature Nutters, we've scouted this beautiful bit of forest pretty successfully this afternoon. So I've definitely earmarked half a dozen good trees. We're going to come back tonight and do a bit of a stakeout on some of those. Obviously get the torches out and do some spotlighting for eye shine. Now we'll obviously continue and show you if and what we get tonight and any other nights that we might do out here if that's the case. But yeah, beautiful bit of mature forest.
Given how many indicators and how strong evidence we saw on this tree, we decided we'd come back before dusk and get set up. And as you'll see shortly, I'm certainly glad we did. This tree turned out to be probably one of the most spectacular I've ever seen in my years.
Alright guys, I know it's getting a bit dark and it's going to be hard to see. The birds have just left. The bats are now starting to kick around. This tree is looking very, very promising indeed. I'm really looking forward until, that last little bit of light. I'm going to be staring up into the canopy there. Excuse me, looking for any incoming gliders, of course. Anything else interesting too. Hopefully there'll be possums and all sorts. But yeah, to keep an eye out for those signs.
So we got off to a cracking start. With the last little bit of twilight, we could just faintly make out the silhouette of this little character, this gorgeous little feathertail glider. Shortly after, some cackling up in the trees, which is this bizarre call of the yellow-belly gliders that you can see in the top of this shot. They came down, and I apologise for the shaky footage, but they started to drink from this wound, which was a little bit higher than I anticipated. So this is a very archaic, spontaneous rig of me gaffer taping a GoPro to stick to get some added reach. Now, before we get too stuck into this, I'm going to make a pretty important point. That is to really try and avoid using white light, strictly for the purpose of obviously filming this documentary. I've used it myself, but I've gone to a long extent to use diffusers over the video light to really soften it to get the bare minimum required for video. However, if you're out enjoying the hobby yourself and you're using white light, you potentially run the risk of illuminating them and bringing them to the attention of their area predators like the owls. I have heard of circumstances where people have been enjoying the hobby only to have an owl come and swipe a glider off the tree in front of them. For example, this is the raw footage displaying exactly how soft a light we are using. Through the power of editing, I'm obviously able to adjust the exposure for better viewing. And I guess with a hobby like this, we have to have as much due care as possible and obviously not destroy what we've come to enjoy. So please, if you choose to do this little hobby, avoid the white light and go for infrared. You'll enjoy it a great deal more. That and you're actually more inclined to see true behaviour. Because they can't see that infrared light, they will behave as normal, whereas with white light they'll have a tendency to freeze up and not really move around and do what they should be doing. So it became aware to us after about half an hour watching these guys that there was a definite pecking order on the tree. The larger yellow belly gliders weren't really phased about these little feathertails, but the feathertail had to avoid the larger gliders. He would opportunistically come in behind them and lap up wounds that they weren't using. But the moment they would move, he'd have to reposition himself and scurry around the tree. So it was a definite juggling act for him to get his fair share. So it was incredibly easy to spend a couple hours watching these guys, which we did do. But throughout that period, I thought, okay, given that this is our first night in the forest, I'll do some recce on some of those other trees that I'd found in the forest. And there was one up by the edge of the road that also had a yellow belly glider, as you can see. But shortly after returning back to the original tree, we had the arrival of our first Crefts glider, which was really nice. But I think this bit of footage really iterates the pecking order on the tree. As you'll see, he comes down to find the yellow belly is there and then decides that he best just move on. However, we do discover on another evening that they do coexist relatively well. It's more the relationship between the Crefts and the feathertails that has an issue. Alright, so that concluded our first night in the forest, and we left so elated after being fortunate enough to get so up close and personal with these guys. But unbeknown to us, this was just the beginning of a series of nights that we returned that only got better and better. So I'll leave you with what we caught over the following nights. We were so incredibly fortunate. I ended up learning so much additional information from this one tree with the behaviour and various travel patterns of these gliders throughout the night. As we patiently sat and watched, you'd hear a tree behind you gently rustle, and you'd find a little crevice glider like this guy here running up the tree beside you. You'd eagerly try and swing across and capture some footage, only to find he's disappearing up through the tree to jump across onto this one. We also observed that when the crevice gliders did arrive, that was the cue for the feathertails to leave. The whole pecking order really dynamically changed when they did. As I mentioned earlier, the yellow bellies didn't have much grief with the little feathertails kicking around with them, but the crefts on the other hand definitely did not allow the feathertails to be there whilst they were. Also, the other really interesting thing we observed was the fact that the striped possum with their specialised little teeth actually did the bulk of the really heavy gnawing and digging into the bark to create the wounds. Yes, the yellow bellies and the other gliders do a small amount, but nothing in comparison to the striped possum did. Every evening there would be these quite substantial sized moths. Often they were even larger than the feathertails themselves. But as you can see in this sequence, one made the fundamental mistake of landing critically too close to the feathertail. It took full advantage, pounced on top of it, and continued to dissect and just absolutely destroy it. The thing I really enjoyed though, as he did, the fibres from the wing would statically adhere to the whiskers, and it clearly frustrated him. He would take a little sniffle and a bit of a sneeze in between mouthfuls. I think my most favourite thing throughout the entire time was when the crevice gliders arrived and they'd bully the feathertails off the tree. The little feathertails had this cool stunt that they'd pull off like a wingsuit diver. They would do a backward somersault roll off the tree, gliding down, landing a few metres further down the trunk. Or otherwise they'd just jettison themselves into one of the neighbouring trees, but unfortunately it was just simply far too fast to capture on video. It was miraculous to see though. So I have a little confession to make. I think I found that the crevice gliders have routine paths that they follow, and that I may have got in the way of one, because as I was up the top of the ladder doing some photos, I had an almighty wallop in my back, and that was one of the crevice gliders had left the neighbouring tree and hit me on top of the ladder, almost knocking me off. Scared the absolute rubbish out of me, but thankfully no harm was done and we went our separate ways. Probably one of the funniest moments we had in the forest with these guys was one of the bats tried to land and have his fair share, and in the process almost landed on the face of one of the gliders and spooked him pretty bad. Okay, so before I totally bore you all to death, there's just one last thing I want to share with you. And that was, as I was producing this, I learnt something quite interesting about the gliders, well, particularly the male gliders. I noticed throughout several of the images that a certain individual would have like a smudge, a greasy mark between his ears. So it turns out it's a very interesting behaviour where he headbutts and nudges the private parts of the female. He gets her hormones and her scent on his head, which he seems to wear with pride. But the primary reason for that is to encourage her into ovulation so as he can successfully mate with her. And then also, secondly, it advertises to other males that he may encounter that he's in control. He's the alpha male here. Alright, so I'll go ahead and wrap this up here. I think you guys get the drift. I'll end this with a few of the other highlights of the various animals that we saw on these trees throughout the forest. We obviously had a blast producing this. They're just such gorgeous animals, so interesting, and their behaviours just, really make you laugh on the inside. Thank you for joining us. Please hit that like and subscribe, and if you enjoyed this, make some comments down below. I'd love to hear if you have any additional thoughts and anything to add. Okay, I promise, one last little conservation message. If yourself or say mum and dad own some bushland, please consider twice before perhaps clearing it. The neighbouring property to where we were filming this, the grazier came through with a massive grader and levelled the joint, took out all the understory and a vast majority of all the trees, really devastating that bit of habitat for the gliders and all the wildlife that resided there. It was just a horrendous mess and an eye-watering eyesore to see. So yeah, please reconsider and think twice before clearing some bushland like this. I certainly hope I've earned your like and subscribe today, and if you find yourself going out and applying these techniques and finding things, I'd love to hear back on your successes. Alright, nature nutters, see you on the next one.